So coronavirus has been a little bit of a mess. Everyone's kind of in a mess when it comes to training for hypertrophy. We're trying to gain muscle. We're trying to do anything, really go to the shops. You know, it's a mess. However, here in New Zealand, I've been lucky enough to effectively, we had 0 cases yesterday. So we're beginning to transition out of it. So me and a few other people are starting to begin to think about transitioning back to normal life. We're not quite there yet, but we're heading our way there. So what I thought it would be a good idea to do is I've gotten probably one of the smartest people I've ever known to speak about this topic. So basically what we're going to be talking about is a little bit of transitioning back to training. So transitioning back to training is a difficult topic because there's a few misconceptions. So people kind of want to go into it quite hard and that might not necessarily be the best approach. So who I've got to talk about this topic today is Dr. Eric Helms. So hopefully a lot of you know who Dr. Eric Helms is. He is a prolific researcher. He has published a lot of research in the bodybuilding space. So he knows a lot about hypertrophy. He also has his PhD and 2 master's degrees in nutrition and in exercise science. So he is very, very well read on the literature. He is also a very, very good bodybuilder. Here's some pictures of him competing last year in bodybuilding. Very, very good, very, very shredded. He also has a very strong bench press, squat, and deadlift. So as a practitioner, he's very, very well rounded. So what's really cool about this is Eric, since he knows so much, he knows quite a reasonable approach, and he knows basically how to move forward. And that's a question that I think we're all asking ourselves: how do we move forward? So I'll cut to the clip now of talking to Eric. Really excited to share this.
One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot recently is when you look at the whole mess that is coronavirus and that whole thing. In New Zealand, we're relatively fortunate. Yeah. We had 0 cases yesterday, which is fantastic. However, a lot of people have been obviously having to change their training quite drastically, and the common theme seems to be people just don't have enough weight to really load themselves to get into the rep ranges that they would like. So for instance, on push-ups, a lot of people have no weights to really load that unless they can put some stuff in a backpack. So a lot of people really can't get the absolute intensity that they're really aiming for. And I think that's changed a lot of people's training to basically skew the rep ranges higher across the board. And even for some people, the RPE can't really get to like an 8, 9, 10 some of the time, or it just tends to not. So is there anything you would sort of recommend for people, or any sort of structure you would propose going forward for people who've had that, where they can't get the absolute intensity as high as they want, but they want to go back into training, maximize outcomes, so what they want to maximize hypertrophy primarily, however, while also minimizing injury risk going forward? Because, you know, if you're relatively detrained, I personally think it would be not the best idea to just go balls to the wall day one, obviously. But what would be your general consensus of moving forward from here, of someone, say once gyms do open, how do people proceed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question, because I think everyone's been tackling the question of how do we train right now. And now that we're seeing some countries, some states, and here in New Zealand, fingers crossed, it looks like in about a week or so, we might be able to get back into the gym. People aren't really tackling, to I think the degree they need to be, how to return to proper training, which is actually really important. And there is both a super cool silver lining here, and there's also a cautionary tale, I would say, with this. The silver lining is that people are going to find out that their strength and their size, or whatever they lost, whatever qualities that they couldn't train, would come back quite well. I've been trying to be pretty prolific about the message of, hey, you know, you can find a way forward, and at least for the goals of hypertrophy, especially, you can make this work, even without any equipment. We were just talking off air about how I just finally hit 3x6 on handstand push-ups, you know, and I found other ways too. Like I'm in the boat you're talking about. I was able to get some stuff, like I secured 90 kilos of weight in a barbell before lockdown. During lockdown, I found, great deal, by the way. Thank you, Dick Smith. $199 NZD for a pair of 24 kilo adjustable dumbbells.
Damn.
But 24 kilos is not a lot.
Yeah.
For someone
like myself, it might be okay, but someone like yourself benching 315 plus, it's like 390 or some shit. Like,
Yeah, so for the record, I benched 363. I love how we're both in New Zealand. We're talking in pounds. You watch the wrong YouTube channels, my friend. I've done 165 touch and go. Not recently, but right now I would probably around 145 or something like that. But anyway, just to illustrate, just yesterday after doing 3x6 on handstand push-ups, I did 3 sets on flat dumbbell bench, and I got and like strict because it makes it harder. And I got 37 reps in my first set, and then 31, and then 24. And I was going to like 9.5, 10 RPEs. So that's not fun. But I imagine if I'd started and not done 3x6 on handstands, which was like a 10 RPE in my last set. Other things I've done, like single arm push-ups, I'm getting sets of 5 there. And obviously 90 kilos. I'm not a very good overhead presser, but that's plenty of weight there. Olympic lifting because I'm crappy and plenty of weight, but I had to stop doing front squats because I just get tired of it. Like I did a little challenge from my Olympic weightlifting coach Stas, who by the way still has not done this challenge. He just told me to do it, and he's like, "Oh, I hurt my back. You do it on your own." So yes, shots fired, Stas. He said, "AMRAP as many reps as possible in 15 minutes with 90 kilos on front squat." And I did like 63, just rest pausing and clustering. It was awful. So yeah, if you're in the same boat as me, you're training a lot. You might be training very hard. You might even be making some great gains in the things that it makes sense to. Like I'm hitting PBs on certain bodyweight movements. My Olympic lifting, my snatch is getting a lot better. I don't have enough weight to really push my clean and jerk. But when I go back, am I going to try to squat 200 kilos plus? Am I going to try to get under a bench press and do 140, 135 on my heavy day like I was doing beforehand? The best I can do right now is 90 kilos with bands strapped around my body, floor press, which is good, but would I add a different motor pattern, a larger range of motion with the bar, and then 50 kilos to that and minus the bands? I don't think that'd be smart. In fact, data would suggest, and this is a complicated area of data, acute spikes in training load are associated with injury. There's some statistical questions as to what the strength of that association is, which variables it is, but I think the concept in general is something that people probably wouldn't disagree with, that there is evidence in multiple sports to suggest, and none on weightlifting yet, that a large acute spike in training load, not the load on the bar, but over kind of globally, the amount of what you're used to is associated with injury. So I think it would be a bad idea to jump right into that. And if we look at what causes muscle damage, if it's going closer to failure, using more load, doing more volume, or doing unaccustomed eccentrics, kind of all of that is going to happen if you've only been doing body weight when you go back in there. And I think it's the big picture answer to your question is we need to take a graded exposure approach to this, but it's going to look a little different for everyone. So for example, some people are going hog wild on like band curls. They're filling out their shirt, but they can't squat. Like Evie, for example, she's doing a ton of chins and bodybuilding work and all this. I don't know how well she's able to do her like big three, and I know she's gonna be really excited to get back into it. So a lot of the folks in the powerlifting community I know right now some of them are training quite hard, some of them are not. And those who are training hard, who don't have access to equipment, their answer is a little different than the people who are not training at all. So if you have been on lockdown and basically just taken an extended period off or train only haphazardly, the answer I think is a little easier. Like whatever you want to go into, whatever your type of training is, you kind of have to treat that as a goal to get to in maybe 3 to 6 weeks. And then in the interweaving period, or interweaving, what that means, the intervening period from now until then, what you would do is just take some fraction of the load, some fraction of the volume, some fraction of the proximity to failure, and just work it out. So for example, if you're, and I'm going to give a really specific example so someone can see how I might structure it. If you normally train, let's say 4 days per week, and you train the bench 3 times, the squat twice, the deadlift once, and you also have accessories sprinkled throughout that, and you're normally training at, let's say, like a 7 to 10 RPE, and you're doing about 15 sets per movement, maybe less on the deadlift, a little bit less on the squat, but together you're doing about 15 to 20 sets of squats and deadlifts, 15 sets of bench, and then let's say 10 sets of bodybuilding work per muscle group. That would be like a really standard kind of intermediate approach to strengthy hypertrophy person. What I'd probably recommend is starting with 3 days per week, cutting the total volume literally in half, the total number of sets, do 50% of that. If your RPs are only between 7 to 10, I think you should start with 5 to 7. And I would say that as far as like any heavy lifting, you could do singles, but again, a single at a 5 RPE would be like what I would start with. Because if you've done no squats, putting a bar on your back is a huge step forward. You're going to be regrouping that motor pattern. And this is kind of the approach I took after my hip surgery back in 2017. I just started doing a couple singles a week, and I started at a very low RPE, like a 5, just whatever I perceived would move, felt heavy in my back, but didn't slow down. And I just built upon that. And once I got a little more confident over multiple weeks, then I moved up to like 6 and 7 RPEs, 7s and 8s, 8s and 9s, 9s and 10s. So I would say, let's go back to that template I gave. So someone is, they first start with 50% of the volume they did, and 2 RPE points downshifted from where they normally would be. The next week, you could do, say, 70% RPE points shifted up. The next week, you could do 90% at your normal RPEs, and then you get back into your normal training. And you might even need a deload in there somewhere. So you might need to like hit pause, repeat the same week again, so you acclimate back. Now, I know I've been talking a lot and I've been monologuing, and you probably have more questions, but one thing I really want to say is this is actually a great opportunity if you've been someone who's been pushing very hard in terms of both proximity to failure, percentage of 1RM, and total volume. That may or may not be more than would be optimal. In general, when you're dealing with motivated individuals and athletes, if there's a bell curve of total training stress, that's ideal. And since this is a video, I'm going to use this like little halo bell curve that I'm doing. At the top here, anywhere in my hand region, the top of the bell curve is going to be roughly the same output as far as what you're putting in. To the left shifted of that, when you're looking at it, that's going to be under training a little bit for what might be optimal. And then to the right of that is going to be you're doing more to the point where now your rate of progress is slowing down because you can't quite recover as well as you might otherwise would with less. Most athletes, I would say in general, if they're highly motivated, especially if they're less experienced, tend to be right shifted. They tend to be doing enough to progress, but it's actually far more than would be ideal. And this comes from the times they plateau. Because the first most obvious answer, especially if you're self-coached, is, well, I just need to train harder. And that sometimes is the answer, don't get me wrong. But sometimes it's kind of a shotgun approach, if you will, or literally taking a shotgun on a fly swatter would be better. It may be you need to train a weak link, adjust your something else outside of the gym, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, this is an opportunity where you have had control alt delete hit for you on life. And you can find out if you were right shifted. So I would actually recommend not just, no matter what, working back up to the old training load you were doing, but in this process of taking this graded exposure and stepwise approach of increasing the total training stress, if you start making fantastic gains, like if you actually start noticing like, whoa, I'm at 70% of where I was, it's week 2, my RPEs are, 7 to 8. I'm normally at 8 to 10 with 30% more volume. And it's A, challenging, because maybe I'm a little detrained, but B, I made great gains. Carry that another week. I would say ride it out until you actually stop progressing. You will probably find you can rapidly get back to where you were. And then the question is, do you go beyond it? Because if you go beyond it with far less, that may be something you want to leverage. As someone who is more experienced in the game than I would say most, having been lifting for 16 years now, I can tell you that having an extended career and having more time making progress versus time plateaued, hurt, burnt out is always a better proposition than wondering, guessing, but never actually knowing that you could be, the grass greener on the other side. You could be making 5% better progress. You would just do more sets. The chasing of optimal more often messes people up than helps them, in my opinion. And if they're currently making progress.
Yeah, and there's what I struggle with is there's no. I was thinking about this literally last night. Like, for instance, with diabetes, which I'm fascinated by, we have a measure very easily where you can test your blood glucose. We have no measure that you can use really to test your the hypertrophy outcomes immediately, acutely post-workout. You can see them like 6 months down the line using photos and measurements. It's like there's no acute measure we can use. So there's literally no way we can find optimal or know that we're in optimal. But I do think, I think Mike has talked about this a little bit, and it's something that I would like to get your thoughts on, and especially in this time, I think it's quite useful. Do you think the use of sort of muscle damage or muscle soreness, to the degree that we can use those interchangeably, do you think we can use muscle soreness as a guide in this time for how much we're doing, how much should we be doing? Do you think we can use that?
In this time is an important caveat. I would say to some degree, yes. But I would say in general, muscle soreness is not a reliable indicator of whether you're doing an appropriate amount of training stress. And that's backed up by the research where you take the same volume, increase the frequency, soreness goes down, but no statistical difference between hypertrophy between groups as an example. So anyway, in the current times, some of the things that tend to drive up muscle soreness and muscle damage the most is going to be doing unaccustomed movements, and especially movements that train you in long muscle lengths, right? So if you were to go back and do, I think I'll do some RDLs and do 3 sets, you're going to be crippled for a while, right? So I think it's important, like if you were to go back and do 50% at a 5 to 7 RPE, certain movements are going to make you sore and you will be surprised. And then just imagine, what if I had done 80% of my volume and I was just 1 RPE step down? The next week, you wouldn't be able to do 50% into 5 to 7 RPE, be so jacked up. So this is actually the same concept as an intra week. People often think of deloads as ways to post hoc deal with being on the right side of that bell curve. I pushed it too far. I'm in too much of a fatigue debt, and I can't push stimulus right now to make good progress. And that's useful. Like if you find every 3rd or 4th week you've got a deload, or that you're on the right side of that shifted curve and you're having trouble performing, that's not a good trade-off. That's like a 3 or 4 to 1 ratio of training intended to reduce the stimulus versus training intended to optimize the stimulus. If you can push that out to say every 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, or 9th week, that's probably better. Take that too far. If you never need a deload, you're probably not training hard enough to be in that middle of it. So right now, it's really easy for you to accidentally push to the far right. Muscle damage is kind of one of those things where it's an intrinsic part of the process of hypertrophy. I think that's the fairest interpretation of literature given the limitations we know. But there is no evidence to suggest that it actually is a causative or additive pathways, but it's very difficult to tell that anyway. Like you can't have overload without causing muscle damage because we're, organic machines, right? So the one thing we can say is that they seem to be disassociated. There is data to suggest that our body prioritizes repairing muscle damage before it starts hypertrophy. And we know that excessive muscle damage and soreness, not even necessarily excessive, measurable muscle damage results typically in decreases in strength, velocity at the same load. It causes acute muscle swelling and loss of range of motion, and that pain can be inhibitory for maximum force production. So if it drops performance and changes your motor pattern and impedes and has to be taken care of, quote unquote, first by the body, too much of it is not helpful. And to the point where you have really noticeable DOMs, it's probably too much, in my opinion. Your mileage may vary there, obviously. But I would say you want a manageable amount of muscle soreness as you get back into your regular training volume. So it is a good gauge to know whether you took a certain movement too far or a certain muscle group too far. And these people will be surprised. Like if you get back into doing like RDLs specifically, and a few other movements I can think of, like heavy full range of motion flies, good mornings, lunges. These are all movements that take certain muscle groups through high loading at their most elongated position. I would do like one set your first week back. Not kidding. One set to like a 5 to 7 RPE because you'll be sore.
Yeah. I did one set with I was just holding a 20 kilo plate doing like straight leg deadlifts, and fuck, I was sore the next day, and I didn't go anywhere near failure. And it's like, what? But it does make sense, as you said.
I did 3 sets of walking lunges in my garage with 40 kilo plates. I did like 39 steps because it was easy, but I did push myself close to failure. And I figured, I've been doing like a ton of squats, ton of Olympic lifts. It's the same thing, right? It's not the fucking same thing. I was sore for 8 days. So I don't think that was probably helpful. So like that's the kind of thing I think people can expect when they get back into this, that certain movements are going to be especially likely to predispose you to soreness, and you want to be careful when doing them, because while doing it, your motor pattern is still back in that cerebellum. The strength is still there. If you've been training, you've kept the muscle tissue. You probably just don't have you're a little rusty in your movements. You don't know what it's like. You might have the actual, like if we were to do evoked contractions with electrical stimulation on you, the force output to be near your max squat or deadlift. But you don't have the skill to do that. And your connective tissue in certain parts of your body, and just your tolerance to the exposure of having 200 kilos loading your spine is going to be very different right now. So here's an example. Like I've trained with a lot of Olympic lifters and a lot of power lifters. If you give an Olympic lifter who can clean 180, something more than they've ever clean pull. So like, let's say someone who's clean 180, they can probably clean pull 210. And a clean pull is basically a conventional deadlift that you're trying to set it up before the clean. So you kind of still have a more upright position. And then when you approach the hip, you actually do an explosive shrug and what looks like a calf raise. And you're training the first and second pull, basically. But it's not the same as a conventional deadlift, where the only thing that matters is in the end, do you stand erect and upright with it without hitching? And it can take 8 seconds to do it. An Olympic lifter who can clean pull 210 can probably deadlift 260, 272, 280 fresh, just like without training the deadlift. If you put 240 in their hands, they'll get it to about their mid shin, drop and God, that wouldn't have gone, because they don't have any experience of what it's like to hold that much weight in their hands, A. And B, to know what it's like to grind at a deadlift when the closest thing they have to it is a slower clean that you don't finish. The difference in velocity, it just feels so heavy. Same kind of thing, like if you're a high bar squatter, and you can high bar squat 200 kilos, right? You probably could within a few sessions, if you have the typical proportions of people, add 10% of that for low bar. But the first time you put a low bar with 140 on your back, it feels like you're being like attacked. You feel like you're dying. And the same thing is true if you go from low bar back to high bar, because your upper traps and that direct loading of your spine, you haven't had that. It feels awful. Same thing with people who never front squat. Like the opposite example. You take a power lifter who can squat 220 and you ask him to do a 140 front squat. It should be easy, right? Not going to happen. They dump that coming out of the hole if they even hold on to it or can get their elbows in the right position. So a lot of the things is not just a matter of did you retain your force output. It's a question of are you still exposed to that stimulus in a more holistic sense? Because we've got there's a meta-analysis where very obviously heavy loads are better for improving one arm, right? But there was no significant difference for heavy loads and light loads for isometric strength, which is basically an unskilled lift. It puts you an isokinetic dynamometer, which basically looks like a machine that can become many different things, leg extension, leg curl, all kinds of shit. But let's say just use a leg extension example. It looks like a leg extension, and the isometric is it puts you at a certain angle and the pad won't move, but it records the amount of force you're putting into it. So that's a completely unskilled lift. It's just you pushing into a pad as hard as you can. And whether you trained 200 kilo squats for singles, or whether you did, lunges to failure with your body weight, with a sufficient load to hypertrophy to the same extent, you're probably going to have very similar force output on that after a familiarization session. Because when you remove the skill component, now all of a sudden, just how much muscle mass do you have is a much bigger component. So, but not as good for one arm strength, because it has to do with intramuscular coordination, and a lot of very specific adaptations to the joint angles, load vectors, and everything that has to do with that exact lift. So I think it's important for people to answer your question, yes, soreness is useful right now, because you shouldn't be crippled as you get back into it. And that's a useful gauge to know whether your graded exposure is appropriate in terms of pace, RPE, volume, and load.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think I think, as you mentioned, like I think you sort of cautioned towards, don't use it too much as a gauge. Like, don't use it to guide every programming decision you make. But I think, I definitely think that's cool. And also, I loved how you touched on sort of just the general idea, there's a lot more adaptations that need to occur rather than just force output. Like, that's not the only thing you lost during this period if you lost it. It's and I think, would you say that for the most part, it's injury sort of prevention we're aiming for here, but also there would be some kind of, there's not really much point. If we're pursuing optimality, there's not really much point going balls to the wall at this point. Like, for outcomes, like, there's not going to be.
You'll make worse gains.
Yeah.
I'll speak to, because if I tell a bunch of, especially young, highly motivated lifters that they might risk injury, their first thought is, okay, but really they're thinking, that's not me. It's the rare person. It's a certain personality type who I don't even need to tell this to, who is super cautious of an injury. It's the person who on YouTube is like, I don't know, like, I noticed your foot moved one degree to the right on that catch of that thing. Or what about you blowing out your back? Or I've always wanted to do powerlifting, but I'm always afraid of getting hurt. I'm not trying to shame those people, but they're out there. They're not the norm.
I think that's me.
I mean, there's nothing, but like, you actually have significant clinical issues. You've experienced pain. But someone who is just like, I've always liked to watch powerlifting, but I've never tried it because I'm afraid of getting hurt. There's people out there. There's nothing wrong with that. And those people in general are overly cautious, so they don't need to hear this message. The people who might need to hear this message, their first thought is, I've registered that logically. I'm not going to act on it, because at a subconscious level, that ain't me, right? And my default is I'm going to work harder. So the message that will actually get through, and it's not what I'm just saying because I really want you not to get hurt, but this is actually true, is you will make worse gains. If you dump a ton of muscle damage into the system, if you do 4 times the volume you're accustomed to, or maybe it's not the volume, 4 times the load. If you do a whole bunch of things that your body is not adapted to, you're just going to shoot right past what would actually produce a stimulus, right?
Yeah. I think that bell curve that you sort of outlined is really important here. Like, it kind of shows, like, okay, here's optimal in this situation. Like, that bell curve still exists, but where you used to be it's not the same place. And
it's general adaptation syndrome. It's an imperfect model for resistance training. Fitness fatigue is a little more elegant. Fitness fatigue overlaid on the background of the biopsychosocial model is probably best. But if we just take it all the way back to pretend it's 1950, because it's still useful as far as understanding the way we adapt, biologically, the general adaptation syndrome. We have the initial alarm reaction, then the resistance stage, and then if we were to push it past what we can resist, we would get into exhaustion. You're basically saying, I'm not interested in resistance. I only want the alarm, and then I'm just going to pedal to the metal, go right into that exhaustion. So it's essentially The resistance stage is the adaptation. So if you rush right past that and overwhelm what your body is able to be exposed to and adapt to currently, because it changes, then you're really kind of you're circumventing the whole point of getting back into training. You might even basically effectively extend the lockdown, right, for yourself.
That's the real problem with coronavirus for us is optimality.
Yeah. So I think a really useful analogy that I want to steal from Mike Tuchscherer, because I think we tend to struggle with thinking in terms of all aspects of us can adapt. When we think of fitness and fatigue, we think there is an appropriate amount of volume for Tom and Jane and Jill and Chris. Like they have, once they find it, they got the perfect program, right? In reality, Tom, Jane, Chris, Jill, all the names that I forgot that I said, they have, the analogy is a sink, right? The amount of training stress that they can handle in the sink is how much water can get into it, right? When the water spills over, that's injury, overtraining, something bad, right? We don't want that, okay? So that means their recovery capacity is the drain size, right? And your ability to add volume, training stress, whatever, is just how much you turn on the faucet. And you can turn on the faucet as much as you want, like as long as you have time in the day, right? If you can find time to go train, hell, you could be at work and just do a chin up on the bathroom door every time you walk through it and just get a little more in. So we're never limited by our ability to turn the faucet. You can always turn the faucet on more. And some people do have smaller or bigger sinks, right? And that may not change very much. That's kind of like those structural components that are not going to change that much, but the more water you turn on, the drain size can adapt and get bigger. But if you turn the faucet on to a faster rate and that drain can grow, it'll still overflow. And that's essentially what I'm talking about. So you want to think about pacing the return to the old faucet pressure you had to the rate at which that drain can grow. And you may find that you are almost always overflowing just a little bit or off and on every few weeks before, and that you'd be better served by having a lower water pressure. And this is an opportunity to find that. So I think that's a useful analogy because it doesn't imply that we're static, and people will find that out. Because if you were to try to do maybe you were the person who landed on Planet Optimal, and you've just been making, as they say on the internet, sick gains, bra, for months. Like you've been just absolutely crushing it, And I can think of a lot of people who are. And if they have not been able to train, if they went right back to what was quote unquote optimal, that will crush them now.
Yeah. I love that analogy. I think that's really, really good analogy. Although my sink doesn't tend to, in real life, I haven't seen my sink size ever change, but I do.
And that's exactly why some of these, like when we think of ourselves like as a car, like, the wear and tear on our joints. And it's like, last time I checked, the ball bearings in your car don't adapt to get stress and strain. So
limitations of analogies.
Yeah. It's important though, because I think we're not good at thinking about that even the biological qualities of our body to deal with adaptation themselves adapt.
Yes. Yeah. I do love that analogy though. I think it's a very, very good analogy.
Shout out Mike T.
Yeah. Shout out Mike T. Yeah. I need to speak to him at some point. I should. So Eric, Dr. Helms,
James,
I believe where can people find you online? I believe you have a podcast, potentially maybe a research review or something like that.
I got all kinds of crazy crap. So I think we just finished our 94th season of the 3DMJ podcast, episode 150, I believe. So you can find that at Team 3DMJ on Instagram, which will then link back to 3dmusclejourney.com, which is a good website to go to. That's the number 3, the letter D, then musclejourney.com. As far as my other podcast with Omar Isuf, Iron Culture, where we explore the science, history, and culture of lifting. And we have a lot more guests on, and we have more varied topics. It's more of a holistic approach to the whole iron game. We're on episode 65, which just dropped today. We had Dr. Mike Zardos on, another Mike who knows what he's talking about. So those are the places. And you can find me at Instagram at Helms3DMJ. I do have a research view as well if you want to get really nerdy. That's monthly applications in strength sport. It's almost over, our anniversary charity sale, but if you sign up now, you can get it at its lowest price that ever is, and all the proceeds for the first month that you sign up go to food banks in America and also Heart to Heart International, which primarily does food banks internationally, obviously, which is one of the things that is you can help with in terms of your finances and donating in the corona times.
Boom. Fantastic.
Hey guys, thank you guys so much for watching this episode. If you did enjoy this podcast, I would really enjoy if you would do one or two things. So, one, if you're listening on YouTube, podcast, wherever, please subscribe to the podcast. That really makes a difference. That sort of shows me that I'm doing something correct, and that basically it shows me you want to listen more. Cool, that's how you do it. So, also, if you would like to give me any feedback, the best way to do that is through the review function on iTunes. Also, that boosts me in the rankings, which really helps me. So if you did enjoy this episode, please do one of those two things. Otherwise, if you would like to find me online, you can go to the Hypertrophy Hub on Instagram or James_Walsham. So thank you guys very much for watching this episode, and I will see you next time.